Chapter 5, Part 1 of The Water Babies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corey Samuel. The Water Babies, by Charles Kingsley. Chapter 5, Part 1. Stern Lawgiver, yet thou dost wear the Godhead's most benignant grace, nor know we anything so fair as is the smile upon thy face. Flowers laugh before thee on their beds, and fragrance in thy footing treads. Thou dost preserve the stars from wrong, and the most ancient heavens through thee are fresh and strong. Wordsworth, Ode to Duty. What became of little Tom? He slipped away off the rocks into the water, as I said before. But he could not help thinking of little Ellie. He did not remember who she was, but he knew that she was a little girl, though she was 100 times as big as he. That is not surprising. Size has nothing to do with kindred. A tiny weed may be first cousin to a great tree, and a little dog like Vic knows that Lioness is a dog too, though she is 20 times larger than herself. So Tom knew that Ellie was a little girl, and thought about her all that day, and longed to have had her to play with. But he had very soon to think of something else. And here is the account of what happened to him, as it was published next morning in the Waterproof Gazette, on the very finest watered paper, for the use of the great fairy, Mrs. Be-Done-by-As-You-Did, who read the news very carefully every morning, and especially the police cases, as you will hear very soon. He was going along the rocks in 3-fathom water, watching the pollock catch prawns, and the wrasses nibble barnacles off the rocks, shells and all, when he saw a round cage of green withies, and inside it, looking very much ashamed of himself, sat his friend the lobster, twiddling his horns instead of thumbs. "What? Have you been naughty, and have they put you in the lock-up?" asked Tom. The lobster felt a little indignant at such a notion, but he was too much depressed in spirits to argue, so he only said, "I can't get out." "Why did you get in?" "After that nasty piece of dead fish." He had thought it looked and smelt very nice when he was outside, and so it did, for a lobster, but now he turned round and abused it, because he was angry with himself. "Where did you get in?" "Through that round hole at the top." "Then why don't you get out through it?" "Because I can't." And the lobster twiddled his horns more fiercely than ever, but he was forced to confess. "I have jumped upwards, downwards, backwards, and sideways at least 4,000 times, and I can't get out. I always get up underneath there, and can't find the hole." Tom looked at the trap, and having more wit than the lobster, he saw plainly enough what was the matter, as you may if you will look at a lobster pot. "Stop a bit," said Tom. "Turn your tail up to me, and I'll pull you through hind foremost, and then you won't stick in the spikes." But the lobster was so stupid and clumsy that he couldn't hit the hole. Like a great many fox hunters, he was very sharp as long as he was in his own country, but as soon as they get out of it they lose their heads, and so the lobster, so to speak, lost his tail. Tom reached and clawed down the hole after him, till he caught hold of him, and then, as was to be expected, the clumsy lobster pulled him in head foremost. "Hello! Here is a pretty business," said Tom. "Now take your great claws and break the points off those spikes, and then we shall both get out easily." "Dear me, I never thought of that," said the lobster, "and after all the experience of life that I have had." You see, experience is of very little good unless a man, or a lobster, has wit enough to make use of it. For a good many people, like old Polonius, have seen all the world, and yet remain little better than children after all. But they had not got half the spikes away, when they saw a great dark cloud over them, and lo and behold, it was the otter. How she did grin and grin when she saw Tom. "Yar!" said she, "you little meddlesome wretch, I have you now. I will serve you out for telling the salmon where I was." And she crawled all over the pot to get in. Tom was horribly frightened, and still more frightened when she found the hole in the top, and squeezed herself right down through it, all eyes and teeth. But no sooner was her head inside than valiant Mr. Lobster caught her by the nose and held on. And there they were, all three in the pot, rolling over and over, and very tight packing it was. And the lobster tore at the otter, and the otter tore at the lobster, and both squeezed and thumped poor Tom till he had no breath left in his body, and I don't know what would have happened to him if he had not at last got on the otter's back, and safe out of the hole. He was right glad when he got out, but he would not desert his friend who had saved him, and the first time he saw his tail uppermost, he caught hold of it and pulled with all his might. But the lobster would not let go. "Come along," said Tom, "don't you see she is dead?" And so she was, quite drowned and dead. And that was the end of the wicked otter. But the lobster would not let go. "Come along, you stupid old stick in the mud," cried Tom, "or the fisherman will catch you." And that was true, for Tom felt someone above beginning to haul up the pot. But the lobster would not let go. Tom saw the fisherman haul him up to the boat side, and thought it was all up with him. But when Mr. Lobster saw the fisherman, he gave such a furious and tremendous snap that he snapped out of his hand and out of the pot, and safe into the sea. But he left his knobbed claw behind him, for it never came into his stupid head to let go after all, so he just shook his claw off as the easier method. It was something of a bull, that, but you must know the lobster was an Irish lobster, and was hatched off Island Magee, at the mouth of Belfast Lough. Tom asked the lobster why he never thought of letting go. He said, very determinedly, that it was a point of honour among lobsters. And so it is, as the Mayor of Plymouth found out once to his cost, 800 or 900 years ago, of course, for if it had happened later it would be personal to mention it. For one day he was so tired with sitting on a hard chair, in a grand furred gown, with a gold chain round his neck, hearing one policeman after another come in and sing, "What shall we do with a drunken sailor so early in the morning?" and answering them each exactly alike, "Put him in the roundhouse till he gets sober so early in the morning," that, when it was over, he jumped up and played leap-frog with the town clerk till he burst his buttons, and then had his luncheon, and burst some more buttons, and then said, "It is a low spring tide. I shall go out this afternoon and cut my capers." Now, he did not mean to cut such capers as you eat with boiled mutton. It was the commandant of artillery at Valletta who used to amuse himself with cutting them, and who stuck upon one of the bastions a notice, "No one allowed to cut capers here but me," which greatly edified the midshipmen in port, and the Maltese on the Nix Mangiare stairs. But all that the mayor meant was that he would go and have an afternoon's fun, like any schoolboy, and catch lobsters with an iron hook. So to the Mewstone he went, and for lobsters he looked. And when he came to a certain crack in the rocks, he was so excited that instead of putting in his hook, he put in his hand. And Mr. Lobster was at home, and caught him by the finger, and held on. "Yah!" said the mayor, and pulled as hard as he dared, but the more he pulled, the more the lobster pinched, till he was forced to be quiet. Then he tried to get his hook in with his other hand, but the hole was too narrow. Then he pulled again, but he could not stand the pain. Then he shouted and bawled for help, but there was no one nearer him than the men of war inside the breakwater. Then he began to turn a little pale, for the tide flowed, and still the lobster held on. Then he turned quite white, for the tide was up to his knees, and still the lobster held on. Then he thought of cutting off his finger, but he wanted two things to do it with, courage and a knife, and he had neither. Then he turned quite yellow, for the tide was up to his waist, and still the lobster held on. Then he thought over all the naughty things he had ever done, all the sand which he had put in the sugar, and the sloe leaves in the tea, and the water in the treacle, and the salt in the tobacco, because his brother was a brewer, and a man must help his own kin. Then he turned quite blue, for the tide was up to his breast, and still the lobster held on. Then, I have no doubt, he repented fully of all the said naughty things which he had done, and promised to mend his life, as too many do when they think they have no life left to mend, whereby, as they fancy, they make a very cheap bargain, but the old fairy with the birch rod soon undeceives them. And then he grew all colours at once, and turned up his eyes like a duck in thunder, for the water was up to his chin, and still the lobster held on. And then came a man-o'-war's boat round the Mewstone, and saw his head sticking up out of the water. One said it was a keg of brandy, and another that it was a cocoanut, and another that it was a boy loose, and another that it was a black diver, and wanted to fire at it, which would not have been pleasant for the mare. But just then such a yell came out of a great hole in the middle of it, that the midshipman in charge guessed what it was, and bade pull up to it as fast as they could. So somehow or other the jack-tars got the lobster out, and set the mare free, and put him ashore at the Barbican. He never went lobster-catching again, and we will hope he put no more salt in the tobacco, not even to sell his brother's beer. And that is the story of the Mayor of Plymouth, which has two advantages: first, that of being quite true, and second, that of having, as folks say all good stories ought to have, no moral whatsoever. No more, indeed, has any part of this book, because it is a fairy tale, you know. And now happened to Tom a most wonderful thing, for he had not left the lobster 5 minutes before he came upon a water-baby. A real, live water-baby, sitting on the white sand, very busy about a little point of rock. And when it saw Tom, it looked up for a moment, and then cried, "Why, you are not one of us! You are a new baby! Oh, how delightful!" And it ran to Tom, and Tom ran to it, and they hugged and kissed each other for ever so long, they did not know why; but they did not want any introductions there under the water. At last Tom said, "Oh, where have you been all this while? I have been looking for you so long, and I have been so lonely." "We have been here for days and days. There are hundreds of us about the rocks. How was it you did not see us or hear us when we sing and romp every evening before we go home?" Tom looked at the baby again, and then he said, "Well, this is wonderful. I have seen things just like you again and again, but I thought you were shells or sea creatures. I never took you for water babies like myself." Now, was not that very odd? So odd, indeed, that you will no doubt want to know how it happened, and why Tom could never find a water baby till after he had got the lobster out of the pot. And if you will read this story 9 times over, and then think for yourself, you will find out why. It is not good for little boys to be told everything, and never to be forced to use their own wits. They would learn, then, no more than they do at Dr. Dulcimer's famous suburban establishment for the idler members of the youthful aristocracy, where the masters learn the lessons, and the boys hear them, which saves a great deal of trouble, for the time being. "Now," said the baby, "come and help me, or I shall not have finished before my brothers and sisters come, and it is time to go home." "What shall I help you at?" "At this poor dear little rock. A great clumsy boulder came rolling by in the last storm, and knocked all its head off, and rubbed off all its flowers. And now I must plant it again, with seaweeds, and coralline, and anemones, and I will make it the prettiest little rock garden on all the shore." So they worked away at the rock, and planted it, and smoothed the sand down round it, and capital fun they had, till the tide began to turn. And then Tom heard all the other babies coming, laughing and singing and shouting and romping, and the noise they made was just like the noise of the ripple. So he knew that he had been hearing and seeing the water babies all along, only he did not know them, because his eyes and ears were not opened. And in they came, dozens and dozens of them, some bigger than Tom, and some smaller, all in the neatest little white bathing dresses. And when they found that he was a new baby, they hugged him and kissed him, and then put him in the middle and danced round him on the sand, and there was no one ever so happy as poor little Tom. "Now then," they cried all at once, "we must come away home, we must come away home, or the tide will leave us dry. We have mended all the broken seaweed, and put all the rock pools in order, and planted all the shells again in the sand, and nobody will see where the ugly storm swept in last week." And this is the reason why the rock pools are always so neat and clean, because the water babies come inshore after every storm to sweep them out, and comb them down, and put them all to rights again. Only where men are wasteful and dirty, and let sewers run into the sea instead of putting the stuff upon the fields like thrifty reasonable souls, or throw herrings' heads and dead dogfish, or any other refuse, into the water, or in any way make a mess upon the clean shore, there the water babies will not come, sometimes not for hundreds of years, for they cannot abide anything smelly or foul, but leave the sea anemones and the crabs to clear away everything, till the good tidy sea has covered up all the dirt in soft mud and clean sand, where the water babies can plant live cockles and whelks and razor shells and sea cucumbers and golden combs, and make a pretty live garden again, after man's dirt is cleared away. And that, I suppose, is the reason why there are no water babies at any watering place which I have ever seen. And where is the home of the water babies? In St. Brandan's Fairy Isle. Did you never hear of the blessed St. Brandan? How he preached to the wild Irish on the wild, wild Kerry coast, he and 5 other hermits, till they were weary and longed to rest. For the wild Irish would not listen to them, or come to confession and to mass, but liked better to brew poteen, and dance the pater a pea, and knock each other over the head with shillelaghs, and shoot each other from behind turf dykes, and steal each other's cattle, and burn each other's homes, till St. Brandan and his friends were weary of them, for they would not learn to be peaceable Christians at all. So St. Brandan went out to the point of Old Dunmore, and looked over the tideway roaring round the Blasquets, at the end of all the world and away into the ocean, and sighed, "Ah, that I had wings as a dove." And far away, before the setting sun, he saw a blue fairy sea, and golden fairy islands, and he said, "Those are the islands of the blessed." Then he and his friends got into a hooker and sailed away and away to the westward, and were never heard of more. But the people who would not hear him were changed into gorillas, and gorillas they are until this day. And when St. Brandan and the hermits came to that fairy isle, they found it overgrown with cedars, and full of beautiful birds, and he sat down under the cedars and preached to all the birds in the air. And they liked his sermons so well that they told the fishes in the sea, and they came, and St. Brandan preached to them, and the fishes told the water babies, who live in the caves under the isle, and they came up by hundreds every Sunday, and St. Brandan got quite a neat little Sunday school. And there he taught the water babies for a great many 100 years, till his eyes grew too dim to see, and his beard grew so long that he dared not walk for fear of treading on it, and then he might have tumbled down. And at last he and the 5 hermits fell fast asleep under the cedar shades, and there they sleep under this day. But the fairies took to the water babies, and taught them their lessons themselves. And some say that St. Brandan will awake, and begin to teach the babies once more, but some think that he will sleep on, for better for worse, till the coming of the Coxigrew. But still, on clear summer evenings, when the sun sinks down into the sea, among golden cloud capes and cloud islands, and locks and friths of azure sky, the sailors fancy that they see, away to westward, St. Brandan's Fairy Isle. But whether men can see it or not, St. Brandan's Isle once actually stood there, a great land out in the ocean, which has sunk and sunk beneath the waves. Old Plato called it Atlantis, and told strange tales of the wise men who lived therein, and of the wars they fought in the old times. And from off that island came strange flowers, which linger still about this land, the Cornish heath, and Cornish moneywort, and the delicate Venus's hair, and the London pride which covers the Kerry mountains, and the little pink butterwort of Devon, and the great blue butterwort of Ireland, and the Connemara heath, and the bristle fern of the Turk waterfall, and many a strange plant more, all fairy tokens left for wise men and good children from off St. Brandan's Isle. Now, when Tom got there, he found that the isle stood all on pillars, and that its roots were full of caves. There were pillars of black basalt, like Staffa, and pillars of green and crimson serpentine, like Kynance, and pillars ribboned with red and white and yellow sandstone, like Livermead, and there were blue grottos like Capri, and white grottos like Adelsberg, all curtained and draped with seaweeds, purple and crimson, green and brown, and strewn with soft white sand, on which the water babies sleep every night. But, to keep the place clean and sweet, the crabs picked up all the scraps off the floor, and ate them like so many monkeys, while the rocks were covered with 10,000 sea anemones, and corals, and madrepores, who scavenged the water all day long, and kept it nice and pure. But, to make up to them for having to do such nasty work, they were not left black and dirty, as poor chimney-sweeps and dustmen are. No, the fairies are more considerate and just than that, and have dressed them all in the most beautiful colours and patterns, till they look like vast flower-beds of gay blossoms. If you think I am talking nonsense, I can only say that it is true, and that an old gentleman named Fourier used to say that we ought to do the same by chimney-sweeps and dustmen, and honour them instead of despising them, and he was a very clever old gentleman, but unfortunately for him and the world, as mad as a March hare. And instead of watchmen and policemen to keep out nasty things at night, there were thousands and thousands of water snakes, and most wonderful creatures they were. They were all named after the Nereids, the sea fairies who took care of them, Eunice and Polynoe, Phyllodos and Samanthe, and all the rest of the pretty darlings who swim round their queen Amphitrite, and her car of cameo shell. They were dressed in green velvet, and black velvet, and purple velvet, and were all jointed in rings, and some of them had 300 brains apiece, so that they must have been uncommonly shrewd detectives, and some had eyes in their tails, and some had eyes in every joint, so that they kept a very sharp look-out, and when they wanted a baby snake, they just grew one at the end of their own tails, and when it was able to take care of itself, it dropped off, so that they brought up their families very cheaply. But if any nasty thing came along, out they rushed upon it, and then out of each of their hundreds of feet there sprang a whole cutler's shop of scythes, javelins, billhooks, lances, pickaxes, halberts, forks, gizzarines, penknives, poleaxes, rapiers, fishhooks, sabres, bradawls, yataghans, gimblets, creases, corkscrews, gorka swords, pins, tucks, needles, and so forth, which stabbed, shot, poked, pricked, scratched, ripped, pinked, and crimped those naughty beasts so terribly that they had to run for their lives, or else be chopped into small pieces, and be eaten afterwards. And if that is not all, every word, true, then there is no faith in microscopes, and all is over with the Linnaean Society. And there were the water babies in thousands, more than Tom, or you either, could count. All the little children whom the good fairies take to, because their cruel mothers and fathers will not, all who are untaught and brought up heathens, and all who come to grief by ill usage, or ignorance, or neglect, all the little children who are overlaid, or given gin when they are young, or are let to drink out of hot kettles, or to fall into the fire, all the little children in alleys and courts, and tumble-down cottages, who die by fever, and cholera, and measles, and scarlatina, and nasty complaints which no one has any business to have, and which no one will have some day, when folks have common sense. And all the little children who have been killed by cruel masters and wicked soldiers, they were all there, except, of course, the babes of Bethlehem, who were killed by wicked King Herod, for they were taken straight to heaven long ago, as everybody knows, and we call them the Holy Innocents. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Chapter 5, Part 2 of The Water Babies, by Charles Kingsley. Read for LibriVox.org by Corrie Samuel. But I wish Tom had given up all his naughty tricks, and left off tormenting dumb animals, now that he had plenty of playfellows to amuse him. Instead of that, I am sorry to say, he would meddle with the creatures, all but the water snakes, for they would stand no nonsense. So he tickled the madrepores to make them shut up, and frightened the crabs to make them hide in the sand and peep out at him with the tips of their eyes, and put stones into the anemones' mouths to make them fancy that their dinner was coming. The other children warned him, and said, "Take care what you are at, Mrs. Be-Done-by-As-You-Did is coming." But Tom never heeded them, being quite riotous with high spirits and good luck, till, one Friday morning early, Mrs. Be-Done-by-As-You-Did came indeed. A very tremendous lady she was, and when the children saw her, they all stood in a row, very upright indeed, and smoothed down their bathing dresses, and put their hands behind them, just as if they were going to be examined by the inspector. And she had on a black bonnet, and a black shawl, and no crinoline at all, and a pair of large green spectacles, and a great hooked nose, hooked so much that the bridge of it stood up quite above her eyebrows, and under her arm she carried a great birch rod. Indeed, she was so ugly that Tom was tempted to make faces at her, but did not, for he did not admire the look of the birch rod under her arm. And she looked at the children one by one, and seemed very much pleased with them, though she never asked them one question about how they were behaving, and then began giving them all sorts of nice sea things, sea cakes, sea apples, sea oranges, sea bull's-eyes, sea toffee, and the very best of all, she gave sea ices, made out of sea cow's cream, which never melt under water. And, if you don't quite believe me, then just think, what is more cheap and plentiful than sea rock? Then why should there not be sea toffee as well? And every one can find sea lemons, ready quartered too, if they will look for them at low tide, and sea grapes too sometimes, hanging in bunches. And, if you will go to Nice, you will find the fish market full of sea fruit, which they call fruits de mer, though I suppose they call them fruits de mer now, out of compliment to that most successful and therefore most immaculate potentate, who is seemingly desirous of inheriting the blessing pronounced on those who remove their neighbour's landmark. And perhaps that is the very reason why the place is called Nice, because there are so many nice things in the sea there. At least, if it is not, it ought to be. Now, little Tom watched all these sweet things given away, till his mouth watered and his eyes grew as round as an owl's, for he hoped that his turn would come at last, and so it did. For the lady called him up, and held out her fingers with something in them, and popped it into his mouth. And lo and behold, it was a nasty cold hard pebble. "You are a very cruel woman," said he, and began to whimper. "And you are a very cruel boy, who puts pebbles into the sea anemones' mouths to take them in, and make them fancy that they had caught a good dinner. As you did to them, so I must do to you." "Who told you that?" said Tom. "You did yourself this very minute." Tom had never opened his lips, so he was very much taken aback indeed. "Yes, every one tells me exactly what they have done wrong, and that without knowing it themselves, so there is no use trying to hide anything from me. Now go and be a good boy, and I will put no more pebbles in your mouth, if you put none in other creatures." "I did not know there was any harm in it," said Tom. "Then you know now. People continually say that to me, but I tell them, if you don't know that fire burns, that is no reason that it should not burn you; and if you don't know that dirt breeds fever, that is no reason why the fevers should not kill you. The lobster did not know that there was any harm in getting into the lobster pot, but it caught him all the same." "Dear me," thought Tom, "she knows everything." And so she did, indeed. And so, if you do not know that things are wrong, that is no reason why you should not be punished for them, though not as much, Not as much, my little man. And the lady looked very kindly, after all, as if you did know. Well, you are a little hard on a poor lad, said Tom. Not at all. I am the best friend you ever had in your life. But I will tell you, I cannot help punishing people when they do wrong. I like it no more than they do. I am often very, very sorry for them, poor things, but I cannot help it. If I tried not to do it, I should do it all the same, for I work by machinery, just like an engine, and am full of wheels and springs inside, and am wound up very carefully, so that I cannot help going. Was it long ago since they wound you up? Asked Tom. For he thought, the cunning little fellow, she will run down some day, or they may forget to wind her up, as old Grimes used to forget to wind up his watch when he came in from the public house, and then I shall be safe. I was wound up once and for all, so long ago that I forget all about it. Dear me, said Tom, you must have been made a long time. I never was made, my child, and I shall go on for ever and ever, for I am as old as eternity, and yet as young as time. And there came over the lady's face a very curious expression, very solemn and very sad, and yet very, very sweet. And she looked up and away, as if she were gazing through the sea and through the sky at something far, far off. And as she did so, there came such a quiet, tender, patient, hopeful smile over her face, that Tom thought for the moment that she did not look ugly at all. And no more she did, for she was like a great many people who have not a pretty feature in their faces, and yet are lovely to behold, and draw little children's hearts to them at once, because, though the house is plain enough, yet from the windows a beautiful and good spirit is looking forth. And Tom smiled in her face, she looked so pleasant for the moment. And the strange fairy smiled too, and said, Yes, you thought me very ugly just now, did you not? Tom hung down his head, and got very red about the ears. And I am very ugly. I am the ugliest fairy in the world, and I shall be, till people behave themselves as they ought to do. And then I shall grow as handsome as my sister, who is the loveliest fairy in the world, and her name is Mrs. Do-as-you-would-be-done-by. So she begins where I end, and I begin where she ends, and those who will not listen to her must listen to me, as you will see. Now, all of you run away, except Tom, and he may stay and see what I am going to do. It will be a very good warning for him to begin with, before he goes to school. Now, Tom, every Friday I come down here, and call up all who have ill-used little children, and serve them as they serve the children. And at that Tom was frightened, and crept under a stone, which made the two crabs who lived there very angry, and frightened their friend the butterfish into flapping hysterics, but he would not move for them. And first she called up all the doctors who give little children so much physic. They were most of them old ones, for the young ones have learnt better, all but a few army surgeons, who still fancy that a baby's inside is much like a Scotch grenadier's. And she set them all in a row, and very rueful they looked, for they knew what was coming. And first she pulled all their teeth out, and then she bled them all round, and then she dosed them with calomel, and jalap, and salts, and senna, and brimstone, and treacle, and horrible faces they made, and then she gave them a great emetic of mustard and water, and no basins, and began all over again, and that was the way she spent the morning. And then she called up a whole troop of foolish ladies, who pinch up their children's waists and toes, and she laced them all up in tight stays, so that they were choked and sick, and their noses grew red, and their hands and feet swelled. And then she crammed their poor feet into the most dreadfully tight boots, and made them all dance, which they did most clumsily indeed. And then she asked them how they liked it, and when they said not at all, she let them go, because they had only done it out of foolish fashion, fancying it was for their children's good, as if wasp waists and pig's toes could be pretty, or wholesome, or of any use to anybody. Then she called up all the careless nursery maids, and stuck pins into them all over, and wheeled them about in perambulators, with tight straps across their stomachs, and their heads and arms hanging over the side, till they were quite sick and stupid, and would have had sunstrokes, but being under the water, they could only have water strokes, which I assure you are nearly as bad, as you will find if you try to sit under a mill wheel. And mind, when you hear a rumbling at the bottom of the sea, sailors will tell you that it is a ground swell; but now you know better. It is the old lady wheeling the maids about in perambulators. And by that time she was so tired she had to go to luncheon. And after luncheon she set to work again, and called up all the cruel schoolmasters, whole regiments and brigades of them; and when she saw them, she frowned most terribly, and set to work in earnest, as if the best part of the day's work was to come. More than half of them were nasty, dirty, frowsy, grubby, smelly old monks, who, because they dare not hit a man of their own size, amused themselves with beating little children instead, as you may see in the picture of old Pope Gregory, good man and true though he was, when he meddled with things which he did understand, teaching children to sing their fa fa mi fa, with a cat o' nine tails under his chair. But, because they never had any children of their own, they took into their heads, as some folks still do, that they were the only people in the world who knew how to manage children; and they first brought into England, in the old Anglo-Saxon times, the fashion of treating free boys, and girls too, worse than you would treat a dog or a horse. But Mrs. Bedonebyasyoudid has caught them all long ago, and given them many a taste of their own rods, and much good may it do them. And she boxed their ears, and thumped them over the head with rulers, and pandied their hands with canes, and told them that they told stories, and were this and that bad sort of people; and the more they were very indignant, and stood upon their honour, and declared they told the truth, the more soundly she declared they were not, and that they were only telling lies. And at last she birched them all round soundly with her great birch rod, and set them each an imposition of 300,000 lines of Hebrew to learn by heart before she came back next Friday. And at that they all cried and howled so, that their breaths came all up through the sea like bubbles out of soda water; and that is one reason of the bubbles in the sea. There are others, but that is the one which principally concerns little boys. And by that time she was so tired that she was glad to stop, and indeed she had done a very good day's work. Tom did not quite dislike the old lady, but he could not help thinking her a little spiteful; and no wonder, if she was, poor old soul, for if she has to wait to grow handsome till people do as they would be done by, she will have to wait a very long time. Poor old Mrs. Bedonebyasyoudid. She has a great deal of hard work before her, and had better have been born a washerwoman and stood over a tub all day; but you see, people cannot always choose their own profession. But Tom longed to ask her one question; and after all, whenever she looked at him, she did not look cross at all, and now and then there was a funny smile in her face, and she chuckled to herself in a way which gave Tom courage, and at last he said, "Pray, ma'am, may I ask you a question?" "Certainly, my little dear." "Why don't you bring all the bad masters here, and serve them out too? The butties that knock about the poor collier boys, and the nailers that file off their lads' noses and hammer their fingers, and all the master sweeps like my Master Grimes. I saw him fall into the water long ago, so I surely expected he would have been here. I'm sure he was bad enough to me." Then the old lady looked so very stern that Tom was quite frightened, and sorry that he had been so bold. But she was not angry with him. She only answered, "I look after them all week round, and they are in a very different place from this, because they knew they were doing wrong." She spoke very quietly, but there was something in her voice which made Tom tingle from head to foot, as if he had got into a shoal of sea nettles. "But these people," she went on, "did not know that they were doing wrong; they were only stupid and impatient, and therefore I only punish them till they become patient, and learn to use their common sense, like reasonable beings. But as for chimney-sweeps and collier boys and nailer lads, my sister has set good people to stop all that sort of thing, and very much obliged to her I am, for if she could only stop the cruel masters from ill-using poor children, I should grow handsome at least 1,000 years sooner. And now do you be a good boy, and do as you would be done by, which they did not, and then, when my sister, Madame Do as you would be done by, comes on Sunday, perhaps she will take notice of you, and teach you how to behave. She understands that better than I do. And so she went. Tom was very glad to hear that there was no chance of meeting Grimes again, though he was a little sorry for him, considering that he used sometimes to give him the leavings of the beer. But he determined to be a very good boy all Saturday, and he was, for he never frightened one crab, nor tickled any live corals, nor put stones into the sea anemones' mouths to make them fancy they had got a dinner. And when Sunday morning came, sure enough, Mrs. Do as you would be done by came too. Whereat all the little children began dancing and clapping their hands, and Tom danced too with all his might. And as for the pretty lady, I cannot tell you what the colour of her hair was, or of her eyes, no more could Tom, for when any one looks at her, all they can think of is, that she has the sweetest, kindest, tenderest, funniest, merriest face they ever saw, or want to see. But Tom saw that she was a very tall woman, as tall as her sister, but instead of being gnarly and horny and scaly and prickly like her, she was the most nice, soft, fat, smooth, pussy, cuddly, delicious creature who ever nursed a baby, and she understood babies thoroughly, for she had plenty of her own, whole rows and regiments of them, and has to this day. And all her delight was, whenever she had a spare moment, to play with babies, in which she showed herself a woman of sense, for babies are the best company and the pleasantest playfellows in the world. At least, so all the wise people in the world think. And therefore, when the children saw her, they naturally all caught hold of her, and pulled her till she sat down on a stone, and climbed into her lap, and clung round her neck, and caught hold of her hands, and then they all put their thumbs into their mouths, and began cuddling and purring like so many kittens, as they ought to have done; while those who could get nowhere else sat down on the sand and cuddled her feet, for no one, you know, wears shoes in the water, except horrid old bathing women, who are afraid of the water babies pinching their horny toes. And Tom stood staring at them, for he could not understand what it was all about. "And who are you, you little darling?" she said. "Oh, that is the new baby," they all cried, pulling their thumbs out of their mouths, "and he never had any mother." And they all put their thumbs back again, for they did not wish to lose any time. "Then I will be his mother, and he shall have the very best place, so get out all of you this moment." And she took up 2 great armfuls of babies, 900 under one arm, and 1300 under the other, and threw them away right and left into the water. But they minded it no more than the naughty boys in Struwell Peter minded when St. Nicholas dipped them in his inkstand, and did not even take their thumbs out of their mouths, but came paddling and wriggling back to her like so many tadpoles, till you could see nothing of her from head to foot for the swarm of little babies. But she took Tom in her arms, and laid him in the softest place of all, and kissed him and patted him and talked to him, tenderly and low, such things as he had never heard before in his life. And Tom looked up into her eyes, and loved her, and loved till he fell asleep from pure love. And when he woke, she was telling the children a story. And what story did she tell them? One story she told them, which begins every Christmas Eve, and yet never ends at all for ever and ever. And as she went on, the children took their thumbs out of their mouths and listened quite seriously, but not sadly at all, for she never told them anything sad. And Tom listened too, and never grew tired of listening. And he listened so long that he fell asleep again. And, when he woke, the lady was nursing him still. "Don't go away," said little Tom. "This is so nice. I never had any one to cuddle me before." "Don't go away," said all the children. you have not sung us one song." "Well, I have time for only one, so what shall it be?" "The doll you lost, the doll you lost!" cried all the babies at once. So the strange fairy sang: "I once had a sweet little doll, dears, the prettiest doll in the world. Her cheeks were so red and so white, dears, and her hair was so charmingly curled. But I lost my poor little doll, dears, as I played in the heath one day, and I cried for her more than a week, dears, but I never could find where she lay. I found my poor little doll, dears, as I played in the heath one day. Folks say she is terribly changed, dears, for her paint is all washed away, and her arm trodden off by the cows, dears, and her hair not the least bit curled. Yet for old sake's sake she is still, dears, the prettiest doll in the world." What a silly song for a fairy to sing! And what silly water babies to be quite delighted at it! Well, but you see, they have not had the advantage of Aunt Agitate's arguments in the sea-land down below. "Now," said the fairy to Tom, "will you be a good boy for my sake, and torment no more sea beasts till I come back?" "And you will cuddle me again?" said poor little Tom. "Of course I will, you little duck. I should like to take you with me, and cuddle you all the way, only I must not." And away she went. So Tom really tried to be a good boy, and tormented no sea beasts after that as long as he lived; and he is quite alive, I assure you, still. Oh, how good little boys ought to be, who have kind pussy mammas to cuddle them and tell them stories; and how afraid they ought to be of growing naughty, and bringing tears into their mamma's pretty eyes. End of Chapter 5, Part 2. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, Part 1 of The Water Babies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corrie Samuel. The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. Chapter 6, Part 1. Thou little child, yet glorious in the night of heaven-born freedom on thy being's height, why with such earnest pains dost thou provoke the years to bring the inevitable yoke, thus blindly with thy blessedness at strife? Full soon thy soul shall have her earthly freight, and custom lie upon thee with a weight heavy as frost, and deep almost as life. Wordsworth. I come to the very saddest part of all my story. I know some people will only laugh at it, and call it much ado about nothing. But I know one man who would not, and he was an officer, with a pair of grey moustaches as long as your arm, who said once in company that two of the most heart-rending sights in the world, which moved him most to tears, which he would do anything to prevent or remedy, were a child crying over a broken toy, and a child stealing sweets. The company did not laugh at him; his moustaches were too long and too grey for that. But, after he was gone, they called him sentimental, and so forth. All but one dear little old Quaker lady, with a soul as white as her cap, who was not, of course, generally partial to soldiers, and she said very quietly, like a Quaker, "Friends, it is borne upon my mind that that is a truly brave man." Now you may fancy that Tom was quite good when he had everything that he could want or wish, but you would be very much mistaken. Being quite comfortable is a very good thing, but it does not make people good. Indeed, it sometimes makes them naughty, as it has made the people in America, and as it made the people in the Bible, who waxed fat and kicked like horses overfed and underworked. And I am very sorry to say that this happened to little Tom. For he grew so fond of the sea bull's-eyes and sea lollipops that his foolish little head could think of nothing else, and he was always longing for more, and wondering when the strange lady would come again and give him some. and what she would give him, and how much, and whether she would give him more than the others. And he thought of nothing but lollipops by day, and dreamt of nothing else by night. And what happened then? That he began to watch the lady to see where she kept the sweet things, and began hiding and sneaking and following her about, and pretending to be looking the other way, or going after something else, till he found out that she kept them in a beautiful mother-of-pearl cabinet away in a deep crack of the rocks. And he longed to go to the cabinet, and yet he was afraid. And then he longed again, and was less afraid. And at last, by continual thinking about it, he longed so violently that he was not afraid at all. And one night, when all the other children were asleep, and he could not sleep for thinking of lollipops, he crept away among the rocks, and got to the cabinet. And behold, it was open. But when he saw all the nice things inside, instead of being delighted, he was quite frightened, and wished he had never come there. And then he would only touch them, and he did. And then he would only taste one, and he did. And then he would only eat one, and he did. And then he would only eat two, and then three, and so on. And then he was terrified lest she should come and catch him, and began gobbling them down so fast that he did not taste them or have any pleasure in them. And then he felt sick, and would have only one more. And then only one more again. And so on till he had eaten them all up. And all the while, close behind him, stood Mrs. Be-Done-by-As-You-Did. Some people may say, but why did she not keep her cupboard locked? Well, I know, it may seem a very strange thing, but she never does keep her cupboard locked. Every one may go and taste for themselves, and fare accordingly. It is very odd, but so it is, and I am quite sure that she knows best. Perhaps she wishes people to keep their fingers out of the fire by having them burned. She took off her spectacles because she did not like to see too much, and in her pity she arched up her eyebrows into her very hair, and her eyes grew so wide that they would have taken in all the sorrows of the world, and filled with great big tears, as they too often do. But all she said was, "Ah, you poor little dear, you are just like all the rest." But she said it to herself, and Tom neither heard nor saw her. Now, you must not fancy that she was sentimental at all. If you do, and think that she is going to let off you, or me, or any human being when we do wrong, because she is too tender-hearted to punish us, then you will find yourself very much mistaken, as many a man does every year and every day. But what did the strange fairy do when she saw all her lollipops eaten? Did she fly at Tom, catch him by the scruff of the neck, hold him, hawk him, hump him, hurry him, hit him, poke him, pull him, pinch him, pound him, put him in the corner, shake him, slap him, set him on a cold stone to reconsider himself, and so forth? Not a bit. You may watch her at work if you know where to find her, but you will never see her do that. For, if she had, she knew quite well Tom would have fought, and kicked and bit and said bad words, and turned again that moment into a naughty little heathen chimney-sweep, with his hand, like Ishmael's of old, against every man, and every man's hand against him. Did she question him, hurry him, frighten him, threaten him, to make him confess? Not a bit. You may see her, as I said, at her work often enough if you know where to look for her, but you will never see her do that. For, if she had, she would have tempted him to tell lies in his fright, and that would have been worse for him, if possible, than even becoming a heathen chimney-sweep again. No, she leaves that for anxious parents and teachers, lazy ones, some call them, who instead of giving children a fair trial, such as they would expect and demand for themselves, force them by fright to confess their own faults, which is so cruel and unfair that no judge on the bench dare do it to the wickedest thief or murderer, for the good British law forbids it. Aye, and even punish them to make them confess, which is so detestable a crime that it is never committed now, save by inquisitors and kings of Naples, and a few other wretched people of whom the world is weary. And then they say, "We have trained up the child in the way he should go, and when he grew up he has departed from it. Why then did Solomon say that he would not depart from it?" But perhaps the way of beating, and hurrying, and frightening, and questioning, was not the way that the child should go, for it is not even the way in which a colt should go if you want to break it in, and make it a quiet, serviceable horse. Some folks may say, "Ah, but the fairy does not need to do that if she knows everything already." True, but if she did not know, she would not surely behave worse than a British judge and jury, and no more should parents and teachers either. So she just said nothing at all about the matter, not even when Tom came next day with the rest for sweet things. He was horribly afraid of coming, but he was still more afraid of staying away, lest any one should suspect him. He was dreadfully afraid, too, lest there should be no sweets, as was to be expected, he having eaten them all, and lest then the fairy should inquire who had taken them. But behold, she pulled out just as many as ever, which astonished Tom and frightened him still more. And, when the fairy looked him full in the face, he shook from head to foot. However, she gave him his share like the rest, and he thought within himself that she could not have found him out. But when he put the sweets into his mouth, he hated the taste of them, and they made him so sick that he had to get away as fast as he could, and terribly sick he was, and very cross and unhappy all the week after. Then, when next week came, he had his share again, and again the fairy looked him full in the face, but more sadly than she had ever looked, and he could not bear the sweets, but took them again in spite of himself. And when Mrs. Do-as-you-would-be-done-by came, he wanted to be cuddled like the rest, but she said very seriously, "I should like to cuddle you, but I cannot. You are so horny and prickly." And Tom looked at himself, and he was all over prickles, just like a sea egg, which was quite natural, for you must know and believe that people's souls make their bodies, just as a snail makes its shell. I'm not joking, my little man, I am in serious, solemn earnest. And therefore, when Tom's soul grew all prickly with naughty tempers, his body could not help growing prickly too, so that nobody would cuddle him, or play with him, or even like to look at him. What could Tom do now but go away and hide in a corner and cry? For nobody would play with him, and he knew full well why. And he was so miserable all that week, that when the ugly fairy came and looked at him once more full in the face, more seriously and sadly than ever, he could stand it no longer, and thrust the sweetmeats away, saying, "No, I don't want any, I can't bear them now," and then burst out crying, poor little man, and told Mrs. Be-done-by-as-you-did every word as it happened. He was horribly frightened when he had done so, for he expected her to punish him very severely. But, instead, she only took him up and kissed him, which was not quite pleasant, for her chin was very bristly indeed, but he was so lonely-hearted he thought that rough kissing was better than none. "I will forgive you, little man," she said. "I always forgive everyone the moment they tell me the truth of their own accord." "Then you will take away all these nasty prickles?" "That is a very different matter. You put them there yourself, and only you can take them away." "But how can I do that?" asked Tom, crying afresh. "Well, I think it is time for you to go to school, so I shall fetch you a schoolmistress, who will teach you how to get rid of your prickles." And so she went away. Tom was frightened at the notion of a schoolmistress, for he thought she would certainly come with a birch rod or a cane. But he comforted himself at last that she might be something like the old woman in Vendale, which she was not in the least, for when the fairy brought her, she was the most beautiful little girl that ever was seen, with long curls floating behind her like a golden cloud, and long robes floating all round her like a silver one. "There he is," said the fairy, "and you must teach him to be good, whether you like or not." "I know," said the little girl, but she did not seem quite to like, for she put her finger in her mouth, and looked at Tom under her brows, and Tom put his finger in his mouth, and looked at her under his brows, for he was horribly ashamed of himself. The little girl seemed hardly to know how to begin, and perhaps she would never have begun at all, if poor Tom had not burst out crying, and begged her to teach him to be good, and help him to cure his prickles; and at that she grew so tender-hearted that she began teaching him as prettily as child was ever taught in the world. And what did the little girl teach Tom? She taught him first what you have been taught ever since you said your first prayers at your mother's knees, but she taught him much more simply. For the lessons in that world, my child, have no such hard words in them as the lessons in this, and therefore the water babies like them better than you like your lessons, and long to learn them more and more, and grown men cannot puzzle or quarrel over their meaning, as they do here on land, for those lessons all rise clear and pure, like the test out of Overton Pool, out of the everlasting ground of all life and truth. So she taught Tom every day in the week, only on Sundays she always went away home, and the kind fairy took her place. And before she had taught Tom many Sundays, his prickles had vanished quite away, and his skin was smooth and clean again. "Dear me," said the little girl, "why, I know you now. You are the very same little chimney-sweep who came into my bedroom." "Dear me," cried Tom, "and I know you too now. You are the very little white lady whom I saw in bed." And he jumped at her, and longed to hug and kiss her, but did not, remembering that she was a lady born. So he only jumped round and round her till he was quite tired. And then they began telling each other all their story, how he had got into the water, and she had fallen over the rock, and how he had swum down to the sea, and how she had flown out of the window, and how this, that, and the other, till it was all talked out, and then they both began over again, and I can't say which of the two talked fastest. And then they set to work at their lessons again, and both liked them so well that they went on well till 7 full years were past and gone. You may fancy that Tom was quite content and happy all those 7 years, but the truth is, he was not. He always had one thing on his mind, and that was, where little Ellie went when she went home on Sundays. "To a very beautiful place," she said. But what was the beautiful place like, and where was it? Ah, that is just what she could not say. And it is strange, but true, that no one can say, and that those who have been oftenest in it, or even nearest to it, can say least about it, and make people understand least what it is like. There are a good many folks about the other end of nowhere, where Tom went afterwards, who pretend to know it from north to south as well as if they had been penny postmen there. But, as they are safe at the other end of nowhere, 999 million miles away, what they say cannot concern us. But the dear, sweet, loving, wise, good, self-sacrificing people who really go there can never tell you anything about it, save that it is the most beautiful place in all the world, and if you ask them more, they grow modest and hold their peace for fear of being laughed at, and quite right they are. So all that good little Ellie could say was, that it was worth all the rest of the world put together, and of course that only made Tom the more anxious to go likewise. "Miss Ellie," he said at last, "I will know why I cannot go with you when you go home on Sundays, or I shall have no peace, and give you none either." "You must ask the fairies that." So when the fairy, Mrs. Bedonebyasyoudid, came next, Tom asked her. End of chapter 6, part 1. Part 2 of The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. Read for LibriVox.org by Corrie Samuel. "Little boys who are only fit to play with sea beasts cannot go there," she said. "Those who go there must go first where they do not like, and do what they do not like, and help somebody they do not like." "Why, did Ellie do that?" "Ask her." And Ellie blushed and said, "Yes, Tom, I did not like coming here at first. I was so much happier at home, where it is always Sunday. And I was afraid of you, Tom, at first, because I was all over prickles. But I am not prickly now, am I, Miss Ellie?" "No," said Ellie, "I like you very much now, and I like coming here too." "And perhaps," said the fairy, "you will learn to like going where you do not like, and helping someone that you don't like, as Ellie has." But Tom put his finger in his mouth, and hung his head down, for he did not see that at all. So when Mrs. Do-as-you-would-be-done-by came, Tom asked her, for he thought in his little head, "She is not so strict as her sister, and perhaps she may let me off more easily." Ah, Tom, Tom, silly fellow! And yet I don't know why I should blame you, while so many grown people have got the very same notion in their heads. But when they try it, they get just the same answer as Tom did. For when he asked the second fairy, she told him just what the first did, and in the very same words. Tom was very unhappy at that. And when Ellie went home on Sunday, he fretted and cried all day, and did not care to listen to the fairies' stories about good children, though they were prettier than ever. Indeed, the more he overheard of them, the less he liked to listen, because they were all about children who did what they did not like, and took trouble for other people, and worked to feed their little brothers and sisters, instead of caring only for their play. And when she began to tell a story about a holy child in old times, who was martyred by the heathen because it would not worship idols, Tom could bear no more, and ran away and hid among the rocks. And, when Ellie came back, he was quite shy with her, because he fancied she looked down on him, and thought him a coward. And then he grew quite cross with her, because she was superior to him, and did what he could not do. And poor Ellie was quite surprised and sad. And at last Tom burst out crying, but he would not tell her what was really in his mind. And all the while he was eaten up with curiosity to know where Ellie went to, so that he began not to care for his playmates, or for the sea palace, or anything else. But perhaps that made matters all the easier for him, for he grew so discontented with everything round him that he did not care to stay, and did not care where he went. "Well," he said at last, "I am so miserable here, I'll go, if only you will go with me." "Ah," said Ellie, "I wish I might, but the worst of it is that the fairy says that you must go alone if you go at all. Now don't poke that poor crab about, Tom," for he was feeling very naughty and mischievous, "or the fairy will have to punish you." Tom was very nearly saying, "I don't care if she does," but he stopped himself in time. "I know what she wants me to do," he said, whining most dolefully. "She wants me to go after that horrid old Grimes. I don't like him, that's certain. And if I find him, he will turn me into a chimney-sweep again, I know. That's what I have been afraid of all along." "No, he won't. I know as much as that. Nobody can turn water babies into sweeps, or hurt them at all, as long as they are good." "Ah," said naughty Tom, "I see what you want. You are persuading me all along to go, because you are tired of me and want to get rid of me." Little Ellie opened her eyes very wide at that, and they were all brimming over with tears. "Oh, Tom, Tom!" she said very mournfully. And then she cried, "Oh, Tom, where are you?" And Tom cried, "Oh, Ellie, where are you?" For neither of them could see each other, not the least. Little Ellie vanished quite away, and Tom heard her voice calling him, and growing smaller and smaller, and fainter, till all was silent. Who was frightened then but Tom? He swam up and down among the rocks, into all the halls and chambers, faster than ever he swam before, but could not find her. He shouted after her, but she did not answer. He asked all the other children, but they had not seen her. And at last he went up to the top of the water, and began crying and screaming for Mrs. Bedonebyasyoudid, which perhaps was the best thing to do, for she came in a moment. "Oh!" said Tom, "oh dear, oh dear! I have been naughty to Ellie, and I have killed her. I know I have killed her." "Not quite that," said the fairy, "but I have sent her away home, and she will not come back again for I do not know how long." And at that Tom cried so bitterly that the salt sea was swelled with his tears, and the tide was 0.3954620,819 of an inch higher than it had been the day before, but perhaps that was owing to the waxing of the moon. It may have been so, but it is considered right in the new philosophy, you know, to give spiritual causes for physical phenomena, especially in parlour tables, and of course physical causes for spiritual ones, like thinking and praying and knowing right from wrong. And so they odds it till it comes even, as people say down in Berkshire. "How cruel of you to send Ellie away!" sobbed Tom. "However, I will find her again, if I go to the world's end to look for her." The fairy did not slap Tom and tell him to hold his tongue, but she took him on her lap very kindly, just as her sister would have done, and put him in mind how it was not her fault, because she was wound up inside like watches, and could not help doing things whether she liked or not. And then she told him how he had been in the nursery long enough, and must go out now and see the world, if he intended ever to be a man, and how he must go all alone by himself, as every one else that ever was born has to go, and see with his own eyes, and smell with his own nose, and make his own bed and lie on it, and burn his own fingers if he put them into the fire. And then she told him how many fine things there were to be seen in the world, and what an odd, curious, pleasant, orderly, respectable, well-managed, and on the whole successful, as indeed might have been expected, sort of place it was, if only people would be tolerably brave and honest and good in it. And then she told him not to be afraid of anything he met, for nothing would harm him if he remembered all his lessons, and did what he knew was right. And at last she comforted poor little Tom so much that he was quite eager to go, and wanted to set out that minute. "Only," he said, "if I might see Ellie once before I went." "Why do you want that?" Because I should be so much happier if I thought she had forgiven me." And in the twinkling of an eye there stood Ellie, smiling, and looking so happy that Tom longed to kiss her, but was still afraid it would not be respectful, because she was a lady born. "I am going, Ellie," said Tom. "I am going, if it is to the world's end. But I don't like going at all, and that's the truth." "Pooh, pooh, pooh," said the fairy. "You will like it very well indeed, you little rogue, and you know that at the bottom of your heart. But if you don't, I will make you like it. Come here, and see what happens to people who only do what is pleasant." And she took out of one of her cupboards (she had all sorts of mysterious cupboards in the cracks of the rocks) the most wonderful waterproof book, full of such photographs as never were seen. For she had found out photography, and this is a fact, more than 13,598,000 years before anybody was born. And what is more, her photographs did not merely represent light and shade, as ours do, but colour also, and all colours, as you may see if you look at a black cock's tail, or a butterfly's wing, or indeed most things that are, or can be, so to speak. And therefore her photographs were very curious and famous, and the children looked with great delight for the opening of the book. And on the title page was written, "The history of the great and famous nation of the Do-as-you-likes, who came away from the country of hard work, because they wanted to play on the Jew's harp all day long." In the first picture they saw these Do-as-you-likes living in the land of Ready-made, at the foot of the Happy-go-lucky Mountains, where flapdoodle grows wild. and if you want to know what that is, you must read Peter Simple. They lived very much such a life as those jolly old Greeks in Sicily, whom you may see painted on the ancient vases; and really there seemed to be great excuses for them, for they had no need to work. Instead of houses, they lived in the beautiful caves of tufa, and bathed in the warm springs 3 times a day; and as for clothes, it was so warm there that the gentlemen walked about in little besides a cocked hat and a pair of straps, or some light summer tackle of that kind; and the ladies all gathered gossamer in autumn, when they were not too lazy, to make their winter dresses. They were very fond of music, but it was too much trouble to learn the piano or the violin, and as for dancing, that would have been too great an exertion. So they sat on ant hills all day long, and played on the Jew's harp; and, if the ants bit them, why they just got up and went to the next ant hill, till they were bitten there likewise. And they sat under the flapdoodle trees, and let the flapdoodle drop into their mouths; and under the vines, and squeezed the grape juice down their throats; and, if any little pigs ran about ready roasted, crying, "Come and eat me," as was their fashion in that country, they waited till the pigs ran against their mouths, and then took a bite, and were content, just as so many oysters would have been. They needed no weapons, for no enemies ever came near their land; and no tools, for everything was ready made to their hand; and the stern old fairy Necessity never came near them to hunt them up, and make them use their wits, or die. And so on, and so on, and so on, till there never were such comfortable, easy-going, happy-go-lucky people in the world. "Well, that is a jolly life," said Tom. "You think so?" said the fairy. "Do you see that great peaked mountain there behind?" said the fairy, "with smoke coming out of its top?" "Yes." "And do you see all those ashes and slag and cinders lying about?" "Yes." "Then turn over the next 500 years, and you will see what happens next." And behold, the mountain had blown up like a barrel of gunpowder, and then boiled over like a kettle, whereby 1/3 of the Do-as-you-likes were blown into the air, and another third was smothered in ashes, so that there was only 1/3 left. "You see," said the fairy, "what comes of living on a burning mountain." "Oh, why did you not warn them?" said little Ellie. "I did warn them all that I could. I let the smoke come out of the mountain, and wherever there is smoke there is fire; and I laid the ashes and cinders all about, and wherever there are cinders, cinders may be again. But they did not like to face facts, my dears, as very few people do; and so they invented a cock and bull story, which I am sure I never told them, that the smoke was the breath of a giant, whom some gods or other had buried under the mountain; and that the cinders were what the dwarfs roasted the little pig's hole with, and other nonsense of that kind. And when folks are in that humour, I cannot teach them, save by the good old birch rod." And then she turned over the next 500 years, and there were the remnant of the Do-as-you-likes, doing as they liked, as before. They were too lazy to move away from the mountain, so they said, "If it has blown up once, that is all the more reason that it should not blow up again." And they were few in number, but they only said, "The more the merrier, but the fewer the better fare." However, that was not quite true, for all the flapdoodle trees were killed by the volcano, and they had eaten all the roast pigs, who, of course, could not be expected to have little ones. So they had to live very hard on nuts and roots, which they scratched out of the ground with sticks. Some of them talked of sowing corn, as their ancestors used to do, before they came into the land of ready-made; but they had forgotten how to make ploughs; they had forgotten even how to make Jews' harps by this time, and had eaten all the seed corn which they brought out of the land of hard work years since; and of course it was too much trouble to go away and find more. So they lived miserably on roots and nuts, and all the weakly little children had great stomachs, and then died. "Why," said Tom, "they are growing no better than savages." "And look how ugly they are all getting," said Ellie. "Yes, when people live on poor vegetables instead of roast beef and plum pudding, their jaws grow large and their lips grow coarse, like the poor paddies who eat potatoes." and she turned over the next 500 years, and there they were, all living up in trees, and making nests to keep off the rain, and underneath the trees lions were prowling about. "Why," said Ellie, "the lions seem to have eaten a good many of them, for there are very few left now." "Yes," said the fairy. "You see, it was only the strongest and most active ones who could climb the trees, and so escape." "But what great hulking broad-shouldered chaps they are," said Tom. "They were a rough lot as ever I saw." "Yes, they are getting very strong now, for the ladies will not marry any but the very strongest and fiercest gentlemen, who can help them up the trees out of the lion's way." And she turned over the next 500 years, and in that they were fewer still, and stronger and fiercer, but their feet had changed shape very oddly, for they laid hold of the branches with their great toes, as if they had been thumbs, just as a Hindu tailor uses his toes to thread his needle. The children were very much surprised, and asked the fairy whether that was her doing. "Yes and no," she said, smiling. "It was only those who could use their feet as well as their hands, who could get a good living, or indeed get married, so that they got the best of everything, and starved out all the rest. And those who are left keep up a regular breed of toe-thumb men, as a breed of shorthorns, or our Skye terriers, or fancy pigeons is kept up." "But there is a hairy one among them," said Ellie. "Ah," said the fairy, "that will be a great man in his time, and chief of all the tribe." And when she turned over the next 500 years, it was true. For this hairy chief had had hairy children, and they hairier children still, and every one wished to marry hairy husbands, and have hairy children too, for the climate was growing so damp that none but the hairy ones could live. All the rest coughed and sneezed, and had sore throats, and went into consumptions, before they could grow up to be men and women. Then the fairy turned over the next 500 years, and they were fewer still. "Why, there is one on the ground picking up roots," said Ellie, "and he cannot walk upright." No more he could, for in the same way that the shape of their feet had altered, the shape of their backs had altered too. "Why," cried Tom, "I declare they are all apes." "Something fearfully like it, poor foolish creatures," said the fairy. "They are grown so stupid now that they can hardly think, for none of them have used their wits for many 100 years. They have almost forgotten too how to talk. For each stupid child forgot some of the words it heard from its stupid parents, and had not wits enough to make fresh words for itself. Beside, they are grown so fierce and suspicious and brutal that they keep out of each other's way, and mope and sulk in the dark forests, never hearing each other's voice, till they have forgotten almost what speech is like. I'm afraid they will all be apes very soon, and all by doing only what they liked." And in the next 500 years they were all dead and gone, by bad food and wild beasts and hunters, all except one tremendous old fellow with jaws like a jack, who stood full 7 feet high, and Monsieur de Chaulieu came up to him and shot him as he stood roaring and thumping his breast. And he remembered that his ancestors had once been men, and tried to say, "Am I not a man and a brother?" but had forgotten how to use his tongue; and then he had tried to call for a doctor, but he had forgotten the word for one; so all he said was "Ububu," and died. And that was the end of the great and jolly notion of the Do-as-you-likes. And, when Tom and Ellie came to the end of the book, they looked very sad and solemn, and they had good reason so to do, for they really fancied that the men were apes, and never thought, in their simplicity, of asking whether the creatures had hippopotamus majors in their brains or not, in which case, as you have been told already, they could not possibly have been apes, though they were more apish than the apes of all aperies. "But could you not have saved them from becoming apes?" said little Ellie, at last. "At first, my dear, if only they would have behaved like men, and set to work to do what they did not like. But the longer they waited, and behaved like the dumb beasts, who only do what they like, the stupider and clumsier they grew, till at last they were past all cure, for they had thrown their own wits away. It is such things as this that help to make me so ugly, that I know not when I shall grow fair." "And where are they all now?" asked Ellie. "Exactly where they ought to be, my dear." "Yes," said the fairy solemnly, half to herself, as she closed the wonderful book. "Folks say now that I can make beasts into men by circumstance, and selection, and competition, and so forth. Well, perhaps they are right, and perhaps, again, they are wrong. That is one of the 7 things which I am forbidden to tell, till the coming of the Cocqcigrues; and, at all events, it is no concern of theirs. Whatever their ancestors were, men they are, and I advise them to behave as such, and act accordingly. But let them recollect this, that there are 2 sides to every question, and a downhill as well as an uphill road; and, if I can turn beasts into men, I can, by the same laws of circumstance, and selection, and competition, turn men into beasts." "You were very near being turned into a beast once or twice, little Tom. Indeed, if you had not made up your mind to go on this journey, and see the world like an Englishman, I am not sure but that you would have ended as an eft in a pond." "Oh dear me," said Tom, "sooner than that, and be all over slime? I'll go this minute, if it's to the world's end." End of Chapter 6, Part 2. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7, Part 1 of The Water Babies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Corrie Samuel. The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley. Chapter 7, Part 1. And Nature, the old nurse, took the child upon her knee, saying, "Here is a story book thy father hath written for thee. Come wander with me," she said, "into regions yet untrod, and read what is still unread in the manuscripts of God." And he wandered away and away, with Nature, the dear old nurse, who sang to him night and day the rhymes of the universe. Longfellow. "Now," said Tom, "I am ready to be off, if it's to the world's end." "Ah," said the fairy, "that is a brave, good boy; but you must go further than the world's end if you want to find Mr. Grimes, for he is at the other end of nowhere. You must go to Shiny Wall, and through the white gate that never was opened, and then you will come to Peacepool, and Mother Carey's haven, where the good whales go when they die; and there Mother Carey will tell you the way to the other end of nowhere, and there you will find Mr. Grimes." "Oh dear," said Tom, "but I do not know my way to Shiny Wall, or where it is at all." "Little boys must take the trouble to find out things for themselves, or they will never grow to be men; so that you must ask all the beasts in the sea and the birds in the air, and if you have been good to them, some of them will tell you the way to Shiny Wall." "Well," said Tom, "it will be a long journey, so I had better start at once. Good-bye, Miss Ellie; you know I am getting a big boy, and I must go out and see the world." "I know you must," said Ellie, "but you will not forget me, Tom. I shall wait here till you come." And she shook hands with him, and bade him good-bye. Tom longed very much again to kiss her, but he thought it would not be respectful, considering she was a lady born, so he promised not to forget her; but his little whirlabout of a head was so full of the notion of going out to see the world that it forgot her in 5 minutes. However, though his head forgot her, I am glad to say his heart did not. So he asked all the beasts in the sea, and all the birds in the air, but none of them knew the way to Shiny Wall. For why? He was still too far down south. Then he met a ship, far larger than he had ever seen, a gallant ocean steamer, with a long cloud of smoke trailing behind, and he wondered how she went on without sails, and swam up to her to see. A school of dolphins were running races round and round her, going 3 feet for her one, and Tom asked them the way to Shiny Wall, but they did not know. Then he tried to find out how she moved, and at last he saw her screw, and was so delighted with it that he played under her quarter all day, till he nearly had his nose knocked off by the fans, and thought it time to move. Then he watched the sailors upon deck, and the ladies with their bonnets and parasols, but none of them could see him, because their eyes were not opened, as indeed most people's are not. At last there came out into the quarter gallery a very pretty lady, in deep black widow's weeds, and in her arms a baby. She leaned over the quarter gallery, and looked back and back towards England far away, and as she looked she sang: Soft, soft wind, from out the sweet south sliding, waft thy silver cloud webs athwart the summer sea. Thin, thin threads of mist on dewy fingers twining, weave a veil of dappled gauze to shade my babe and me. Deep, deep love, within thine own abyss abiding, pour thyself abroad, O Lord, on earth and air and sea. Worn, weary hearts within thy holy temple hiding, shield from sorrow, sin, and shame my helpless babe and me. Her voice was so soft and low, and the music of the air so sweet, that Tom could have listened to it all day. But as she held the baby over the gallery rail, to show it the dolphins leaping and the water gurgling in the ship's wake, lo and behold, the baby saw Tom. He was quite sure of that, for when their eyes met, the baby smiled and held out his hands, and Tom smiled and held out his hands too, and the baby kicked and leaped, as if it wanted to jump overboard to him. "What do you see, my darling?" said the lady, and her eyes followed the baby's, till she too caught sight of Tom, swimming about in the foam beads below. She gave a little shriek and start, and then she said, quite quietly, "Babies in the sea? Well, perhaps it is the happiest place for them," and waved her hand to Tom, and cried, "Wait a little, darling, only a little, and perhaps we shall go with you and be at rest." And at that an old nurse, all in black, came out and talked to her, and drew her in. And Tom turned away northward, sad and wondering, and watched the great steamer slide away into the dusk, and the lights on board peep out one by one, and die out again, and the long bar of smoke fade away into the evening mist, till all was out of sight. And he swam northward again, day after day, till at last he met the King of the Herrings, with a currycomb growing out of his nose, and a sprat in his mouth for a cigar, and asked him the way to Shiny Wall. So he bolted his sprat head foremost, and said, "If I were you, young gentleman, I should go to the All Alone Stone, and ask the last of the Gairfowl. She is of a very ancient clan, very nearly as ancient as my own, and knows a great deal which these modern upstarts don't, as ladies of old houses are likely to do." Tom asked his way to her, and the King of the Herrings told him very kindly, for he was a courteous old gentleman of the old school, though he was horribly ugly, and strangely bedizened too, like the old dandies who lounge in the club-house windows. But just as Tom had thanked him and set off, he called after him, "Hi, I say, can you fly?" "I never tried," says Tom. "Why?" "Because if you can, I should advise you to say nothing to the old lady about it. There, take a hint. Good-bye." And away Tom went for 7 days and 7 nights due north-west, till he came to a great cod-bank, the like of which he never saw before. The great cod lay below in tens of thousands, and gobbled shellfish all day long, and the blue sharks roved above in hundreds, and gobbled them when they came up. So they ate, and ate, and ate each other, as they had done since the making of the world, for no man had come here yet to catch them, and find out how rich Mother Carey is. And there he saw the last of the Gairfowl, standing up on the All Alone stones, all alone. And a very grand old lady she was, full 3 feet high, and bolt upright, like some old Highland chieftainess. She had on a black velvet gown, and a white pinner and apron, and a very high bridge to her nose, which is a sure mark of high breeding, and a large pair of white spectacles on it, which made her look rather odd, but it was the ancient fashion of her house. And instead of wings, she had 2 feathery little arms, with which she fanned herself, and complained of the dreadful heat. And she kept on crooning an old song to herself, which she learnt when she was a little baby bird long ago. 2 little birds, they sat on a stone, one swam away, and then there was one, with a fa-la-la lady. The other swam after, and then there was none, and so the poor stone was left all alone, with a fa-la-la lady. It was flew away properly, and not swam away, but, as she could not fly, she had a right to alter it. However, it was a very fit song for her to sing, because she was a lady herself. Tom came up to her very humbly, and made his bow, and the first thing she said was, "Have you wings? Can you fly?" "Oh dear, no, ma'am, I should not think of such a thing," said cunning little Tom. "Then I shall have great pleasure in talking to you, my dear. It is quite refreshing nowadays to see anything without wings. They must all have wings, forsooth now, every new upstart sort of bird, and fly. What can they want with flying, and raising themselves above their proper station in life? In the days of my ancestors, no birds ever thought of having wings, and did very well without. And now they all laugh at me because I keep to the good old fashion. Why, the very marrocks and dovekies have got wings, the vulgar creatures, and poor little ones enough they are. And my own cousins too, the razorbills, who are gentlefolk born, and ought to know better than to ape their inferiors." And so she was running on, while Tom tried to get in a word edgeways, and at last he did, when the old lady got out of breath, and began fanning herself again, and then he asked if she knew the way to Shiny Wall. "Shiny Wall? Who should know better than I? We all came from Shiny Wall thousands of years ago, when it was decently cold, and the climate was fit for gentlefolk. But now, what with the heat, and what with those vulgar winged things who fly up and down and eat everything, so that gentle people's hunting is all spoiled, and one really cannot get one's living, or hardly venture off the rock for fear of being flown against by some creature that would not have dared to come within a mile of one 1,000 years ago. What was I saying? Why, we have quite gone down in the world, my dear, and have nothing left but our honour. And I am the last of my family. A friend of mine and I came and settled on this rock when we were young, to be out of the way of low people. Once we were a great nation, and spread all over the Northern Isles. But men shot us so, and knocked us on the head, and took our eggs. Why, if you will believe it, they say that on the coast of Labrador the sailors used to lay a plank from the rock on board the thing called their ship, and drive us along the plank by hundreds, till we tumbled down into the ship's waist in heaps. And then, I suppose, they ate us, the nasty fellows. Well, but what was I saying? At last there were none of us left, except on the old Gairfowl Skerry, just off the Iceland coast, up which no man could climb. Even there we had no peace, for one day, when I was quite a young girl, the land rocked, and the sea boiled, and the sky grew dark, and all the air was filled with smoke and dust, and down tumbled the old Gairfowl Skerry into the sea. The dovekies and marrocks, of course, all flew away, but we were too proud to do that. Some of us were dashed to pieces, and some drowned, and those who were left got away to Eldey, and the dovekies tell me that they are all dead now, and that another Gairfowl Skerry has risen out of the sea close to the old one, but that it is such a poor flat place that it is not safe to live on, and so here I am left alone." This was the Gairfowl's story, and, strange as it may seem, it is every word of it true. "If you only had wings," said Tom, "then you might all have flown away too." "Yes, young gentleman, and if people are not gentlemen and ladies, and forget that noblesse oblige, they will find it as easy to get on in the world as other people who don't care what they do. Why, if I had not recollected that noblesse oblige, I should not have been all alone now." And the poor old lady sighed. "How was that, ma'am?" "Why, my dear, a gentleman came hither with me, and after we had been here some time, he wanted to marry. In fact, he actually proposed to me. Well, I can't blame him. I was young and very handsome then, I don't deny. But you see, I could not hear of such a thing, because he was my deceased sister's husband, you see." "Of course not, ma'am," said Tom, though of course he knew nothing about it. "She was very much diseased, I suppose?" "You do not understand me, my dear. I mean that being a lady, and with right and honourable feelings, as our house has always had, I felt it my duty to snub him, and howk him, and peck him continually, to keep him at his proper distance. And, to tell the truth, I once pecked him a little too hard, poor fellow, and he tumbled backwards off the rock, and really it was very unfortunate, but it was not my fault. A shark coming by saw him flapping, and snapped him up, and since then I have lived all alone, with a fa-la-la lady. And soon I shall be gone, my little dear, and nobody will miss me, and then the poor stone will be left all alone." "But, please, which is the way to Shiny Wall?" said Tom. "Oh, you must go, my little dear, you must go. Let me see, I'm sure, that is, really, my poor old brains are getting quite puzzled. Do you know, my little dear, I'm afraid, if you want to know, you must ask some of these vulgar birds about, for I have quite forgotten." And the poor old Gairfowl began to cry tears of pure oil, and Tom was quite sorry for her, and for himself too, for he was at his wits' end whom to ask. But by there came a flock of petrels, who were Mother Carey's own chickens, and Tom thought them much prettier than Lady Gairfowl, and so perhaps they were, for Mother Carey had had a great deal of fresh experience between the time that she invented the Gairfowl and the time that she invented them. They flitted along like a flock of black swallows, and hopped and skipped from wave to wave, lifting up their little feet behind them so daintily, and whistling to each other so tenderly, that Tom fell in love with them at once, and called them to know the way to Shiny Wall. "Shiny Wall? Do you want Shiny Wall? Then come with us, and we will show you. We are Mother Carey's own chickens, and she sends us out all over the seas to show the good birds the way home." Tom was delighted, and swam off to them, after he had made his bow to the Gairfowl. But she would not return his bow, but held herself bolt upright, and wept tears of oil as she sang. And so the poor stone was left all alone, with a fa-la-la-la lady. But she was wrong there, for the stone was not left all alone, and the next time that Tom goes by it, he will see a sight worth seeing. The old Gairfowl is gone already, but there are better things come in her place, and when Tom comes, he will see the fishing smacks anchored there in hundreds, from Scotland, and from Ireland, and from the Orkneys, and the Shetlands, and from all the northern ports, full of the children of the old Norse Vikings, the masters of the sea. And the men will be hauling in the great cod by thousands, till their hands are sore from the lines, and they will be making cod-liver oil and guano, and salting down the fish, and there will be a man-of-war steamer there to protect them, and a lighthouse to show them the way. And you and I, perhaps, shall go some day to the All-Alone Stone, to the great summer sea fair, and dredge strange creatures, such as man never saw before, and we shall hear the sailors boast that it is not the worst jewel in Queen Victoria's crown, for there are 80 miles of cod-bank, and food for all the poor folk in the land. That is what Tom will see, and perhaps you and I shall see it too. And then we shall not be sorry because we cannot get a Gairfowl to stuff, much less find Gairfowl enough to drive them into stone pens, and slaughter them, as the old Norsemen did, or drive them on board along a plank, till the ship was victualled with them, as the old English and French rovers used to do, of whom dear old Hakluyt tells. But we shall remember what Mr. Tennyson says, how "the old order changeth, giving place to the new, and God fulfils himself in many ways." And now Tom was all agog to start for Shiny Wall, but the petrels said no. They must go first to All Fowls' Nest, and wait there for the great gathering of all sea birds, before they start for their summer breeding places far away in the northern isles. And there they would be sure to find some birds which were going to Shiny Wall. But where All Fowls' Nest was, he must promise never to tell, lest men should go there and shoot the birds, and stuff them, and put them into stupid museums, instead of leaving them to play and breed and work in Mother Carey's water garden, where they ought to be. So where All Fowls' Nest is, nobody must know, and all that is to be said about it is, that Tom waited there many days, and as he waited he saw a very curious sight. On the rabbit burrows on the shore there gathered hundreds and hundreds of hoodie crows, such as you see in Cambridgeshire, and they made such a noise that Tom came on shore and went up to see what was the matter. And there he found them holding their great caucus, which they hold every year in the north, and all their stump orators were speechifying, and for a tribune the speaker stood on an old sheep's skull. And they cawed and boasted of all the clever things they had done, how many lambs' eyes they had picked out, and how many dead bullocks they had eaten, and how many young grouse they had swallowed whole, and how many grouse eggs they had flown away with, stuck on the point of their bills, which is the hoodie crow's particularly clever feat, of which he is as proud as a gipsy is of doing the Hocany barrow, and what that is I won't tell you. And at last they brought out the prettiest, neatest young lady crow that ever was seen, and set her in the middle, and all began abusing and vilifying and rating and bully-ragging at her, because she had stolen no grouse eggs, and had actually dared to say that she would not steal any. So she was there to be tried publicly by their laws, for the hoodies always try some offenders in their great yearly parliament. And there she stood in the middle, in her black gown and grey hood, looking as meek and as neat as a Quakeress, and they all bawled at her at once. And it was in vain that she pleaded, that she did not like grouse eggs, that she could get her living very well without them, that she was afraid to eat them for fear of the gamekeepers, that she had not the heart to eat them, because the grouse were such pretty kind jolly birds, and a dozen reasons more. For all the other scowl crows set upon her, and pecked her to death there and then, before Tom could come to help her, and then flew away very proud of what they had done. Now, was not this a scandalous transaction? But they are true republicans, these hoodies, who do every one just what he likes, and make other people do so too, so that for any freedom of speech, thought, or action which is allowed among them, they might as well be American citizens of the new school. But the fairies took the good crow, and gave her 9 new sets of feathers running, and turned her at last into the most beautiful bird of paradise, with a green velvet suit and a long tail, and sent her to eat fruit in the Spice Islands, where cloves and nutmegs grow. And Mrs. Be-done-by-as-you-did settled her account with the wicked hoodies, for as they flew away, what should they find but a nasty dead dog, on which they all set to work, pecking and gobbling and cawing and quarrelling to their hearts' content. But the moment afterwards they all threw up their bills into the air, and gave one screech, and then turned head over heels backward, and fell down dead, 123 of them at once. For why? The fairy had told the gamekeeper in a dream to fill the dead dog full of strychnine, and so he did. And after a while the birds began to gather at All Fowls' Nest, in thousands and tens of thousands, blackening all the air, swans and brant geese, harlequins and eiders, harolds and garganets, smews and goosanders, divers and loons, grebes and dovekies, auks and razorbills, gannets and petrels, skuas and terns, with gulls beyond all naming or numbering. And they paddled and washed and splashed and combed and brushed themselves on the sand, till the shore was white with feathers, and they quacked and clucked and gabbled and chattered and screamed and whooped as they talked over matters with their friends, and settled where they were to go and breed that summer, till you might have heard them 10 miles off. And lucky it was for them that there was no one to hear them but the old keeper, who lived all alone upon the Ness, in a turf hut thatched with heather, and fringed round with great stones, slung across the roof by bent ropes, lest the winter gales should blow the hut right away. But he never minded the birds, nor hurt them, because they were not in season. Indeed, he minded but 2 things in the whole world, and those were his Bible and his grouse. for he was as good an old Scotchman as ever knit stockings on a winter's night; only, when all the birds were going, he toddled out, and took off his cap to them, and wished them a merry journey and a safe return, and then gathered up all the feathers which they had left, and cleaned them to sell down south, and make feather beds for stuffy people to lie on. CHAPTER 8.